They said, when she dies, we get the house. They didn't whisper, not really. They just lowered their voices enough to make it sound civilized, like greed wrapped in linen napkins. I was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, holding the teapot, pretending to be slower than I am. I heard every syllable. I even heard the tiny sigh my son made afterward, that weary sound that meant he wasn't shocked, only embarrassed that his wife had said it out loud. He didn't correct her. He didn't say, "Mom's still alive, for God's sake." He just clinked his fork against his plate and said, "Let's not talk about this now." I walked back to the table, poured the tea, and smiled like a woman whose hearing had already gone. That's the first lie you learn in old age, to act deaf when your heart can't bear another insult. I'm 78. The house they were dividing with their eyes is the one my husband and I built in 1972, back when everything still smelled of cedar and plaster dust, when we couldn't afford proper floorboards and he sanded plywood until his hands blistered. Every groove in the wood still carries the shape of us, our choices, our arguments, the rhythm of a life built from paychecks and patience. After he died, I stayed because the walls still knew my name. I thought my son did too. I was wrong. It's strange how betrayal doesn't sound like shouting. It sounds like paperwork, the tone of polite conversation. I stood there that Sunday, looking at the roast I'd made, the candles I'd lit, the little vase of yellow tulips I'd picked from the garden because Lisa liked a pop of color. I'd dressed the table like a peace offering because families are fragile, now always needing translation. I'd hoped the meal might soften whatever invisible distance had grown between us. Instead, it was the moment I saw the edges of it, sharp and real. After lunch, Lisa helped herself to another glass of wine and told me how exhausting the real estate market was. "You wouldn't believe what people pay for space now," she said, waving her manicured hand like a magician dismissing a trick. "Even small houses are gold." My son nodded, his face calm, professional. He's an accountant. Numbers are his only safe language. "Property's the most reliable asset," he added. And then they smiled at each other, a quick flash of mutual understanding that didn't need me. They were talking about value, not memory, investment, not legacy. I felt it in my throat like dust. When they left that evening, Lisa kissed my cheek, dry, perfunctory, the kind of kiss that lands somewhere near your face but never reaches you. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor," she said, as if she were saying goodbye to a tenant. I watched their car pull out of the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the old lilac bushes that still bloom every spring, no matter who ignores them. The silence afterward felt heavy, not peaceful. That was when I sat at the kitchen table and said it out loud to no one. "They're waiting for me to die." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded factual, like weather. The next morning, I went about my rituals as always. I boiled water in the old kettle that squeals like a gull, fed the stray cat that's decided my porch is hers, and walked through the house with my coffee, touching things I hadn't noticed in years. The chipped frame of our wedding photo, the small dent in the banister where my son's toy truck once crashed, the sun stain on the rug shaped like a halo. Everything carried the scent of time, even the dust. I tried to imagine someone else living here, moving my furniture, repainting the walls, removing the curtains I sewed by hand. The thought made my chest ache in a slow, deliberate way, like arthritis of the heart. I suppose I should have confronted them, demanded to know if that's what they truly thought. But what would have been the point? People don't admit to planning your disappearance while you're still useful for Sunday dinners. They'll just look offended and tell you to rest more. So I said nothing. I let the silence grow between us like ivy, winding through every conversation. I answered their texts politely. I smiled at their advice about downsizing. and I started to plan in secret. The house was mine, not a gift, not a loan, not a sentimental relic. Mine, bought with years of double shifts and unpaid favors and careful saving. The irony was, they thought they were waiting for my death. They didn't realize they'd already killed something far rarer, my loyalty. That night, I couldn't sleep. The clock in the hallway ticked too loudly. The shadows of the oak outside swung across the ceiling like restless arms. I lay there remembering the years when this place was full of noise, laughter, fights, the smell of burnt toast, my husband humming off key while he fixed a drawer. The rooms have learned to keep secrets since then, but even walls, I think, can tell when a house has turned against its owner. I felt it that night, the faint hum of endings. At dawn, I brewed tea again and sat by the window, watching the fog roll across the yard. There's a particular kind of calm that comes after humiliation. It's not peace, it's decision. I realized I could stay here and let them circle like vultures, or I could leave on my own terms. I didn't yet know what that meant. I just knew I couldn't keep living in a house that had become their future instead of my present. I still remember my husband's last words before the hospital took him. Don't let them take what we built. At the time, I thought he meant sentiment. Now I understand he meant the deed. That morning, after years of keeping everything exactly as it was, I opened the drawer where we kept our papers, the one labeled house in my tidy handwriting. The key was still tied to a ribbon. I turned it over in my palm, feeling the metal warm under my skin. And for the first time in a decade, I thought about selling, not because I needed money, but because I needed air. Later that day, my son called. Hey, Mom, Lisa was worried she might have said something insensitive yesterday, he began, his voice cautious, rehearsed. You know how she talks. I smiled at the phone. I know exactly how she talks, I said. He laughed nervously. Anyway, we just want you to be comfortable. Maybe it's time to think about assisted living, a place with people your age. I almost laughed. People my age, I repeated. You mean people waiting for someone else to sign their fate? He didn't answer. There was a small silence, then the sound of him clearing his throat. Just think about it, okay? He said. I promised I would. That was another lie. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table again, tracing the wood grain with my finger. The same table where my husband once balanced our first mortgage statement. I thought about all the meals served here, the birthdays, the arguments, the reconciliations, the long nights of solitude afterward. Then I thought about Lisa's words. When she dies, we get the house. The arrogance of it burned slower than fire. It didn't make me want to scream. It made me want to disappear on my own schedule. So I made a list on the back of an old envelope. Call lawyer, find appraiser, pack essentials. I didn't cry. I didn't even tremble. I felt steady, like the tide before a storm. Because once a woman reaches a certain age, the worst has already happened so many times that another ending feels almost merciful. I looked around the kitchen, the soft light spilling through the lace curtains, the faint smell of rosemary from last night's roast, and I whispered to my husband's empty chair, They think they'll inherit a house. They don't know they're about to lose a mother. That's how it began, not with rage, but with clarity, quiet as dawn. That's the moment the house stopped being theirs in waiting and became mine again in motion. It was almost comical, the way the universe arranged itself to confirm what I had heard and pretended not to hear. 2 days after that Sunday lunch, I told myself I was being dramatic, that maybe I had twisted Lisa's tone in my mind, that perhaps when she dies, "We get the house," had been a flippant, tasteless joke, and nothing more, the kind of stupid phrase people say when they are too comfortable and too sure of their place in your life. I gave them the benefit of a doubt I no longer believed they deserved, because mothers are trained to doubt their own hurt before they doubt their children's motives. I did what women of my age do when something threatens to pierce the skin. I baked. It sounds silly, I know, but I took out flour and sugar and cinnamon and made the apple cake my son used to ask for on his birthdays, back when he still had jam on his cheeks and scraped knees, before his voice learned that professional calm that sounds like an apology and a closing argument at once. The cake was for no one in particular. Old habits reach for sweetness when the air turns sour. I had just taken it out of the oven, the whole kitchen filled with that thick, forgiving smell of butter and spice, when my phone lit up on the counter with his name. I almost let it ring out, but reflex is stronger than resolve, so I wiped my hands, picked up, and said his name before hello, as if that might call back a different version of him. His tone was light, a little too light, the way people sound when they've rehearsed something and are trying to walk it in casually. He asked how I was, whether I was getting out, whether my knees were bothering me, whether I'd thought more about the communities he'd mentioned, the ones with activities and support and no maintenance stress. I asked him if Lisa had enjoyed the tulips. He said yes, distracted, like he was flipping pages on his computer. Then, after a careful pause, he said there was another thing, no rush, just something smart to set up while everything is fine. And the moment those words lined up, I felt my body go very still, the way it used to when a patient came in gray and quiet, and I knew before the test that we were past the point of pretending. He started talking about power of attorney, about it being standard, about how complicated things could get if something happened, about how, given the house and my assets, it would simplify a lot of future burdens if he could handle the paperwork when the time came. He wrapped it all in that softening language bureaucrats use when they are about to erase someone. I let him finish, did not interrupt, listened to him present my life in bullet points. When he finally ran out of words, I asked, as gently as I could manage, "Is this your idea or Lisa's?" He hesitated for exactly one breath too long and said, "It's just responsible, Mom." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I just told him to email whatever he thought I should read and that I would look it over. That was all. He sounded relieved, mistaking my quiet for compliance, not recognizing it as distance. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of a cake nobody had earned, and understood that Sunday's sentence had not been a slip. It had been policy. I poured myself a cup of tea I never tasted and walked slowly down the hallway to the small room my husband once called our command center, where we kept bills and instructions and the paper backbone of a life people assume just appears. The drawer with the documents stuck as always halfway, then gave way with the same reluctant groan, and there, in a neat row, lay the files I had labeled in my careful, rounded hand 30, 40 years ago. I slid out the thick envelope marked with the address of this house, our house, the one they had already placed on some invisible timeline. The deed was there. My name first, full and unambiguous, his name below, the bank stamp, the date we signed when we were still young enough that interest rates frightened us, but commitment did not. I ran my finger along the ink as if checking whether it still held, as if names could fade from a page the way they fade from a child's gratitude. Behind it was the addendum my husband had insisted on after his second scare with his heart, a clause reiterating my full ownership, his careful, stubborn way of building a wall around me, even from the grave. so they can never push you out anywhere you don't choose to go. He'd said that day in the lawyer's office, his big hand covering mine, his voice hoarse but certain. Back then I had laughed and called him dramatic. Now I saw it for what it was. Foresight, sharpened by love. There was another envelope tucked farther back, thinner, newer, one I did not remember placing. I opened it and found printouts, emails, mortgage offers, something from a financial advisor. They were addressed to my son, not to me, but one short thread caught my eye, the kind of thing people forget to delete when they think the old woman only sees what's in front of her. A message from some consultant about projected inheritance, the phrase primary residence transition, highlighted in yellow, the suggested assumption that property will pass to son and spouse within 5 to 10 years, depending on health. Trajectory. There is a kind of nausea that isn't physical, that doesn't rise from your stomach, but from your memories all at once, a wave of understanding that leaves your hands cold. 5 to 10 years, health trajectory. I had been graphed. I sat down at the small desk, the chair creaking under a body older than I feel, and laid everything out in front of me like evidence. I thought perhaps I would cry, but tears didn't come. Something drier did, something exact. They weren't planning how to help. They were planning how to harvest. I thought of Lisa's bright, careless voice. When she dies, we get the house, and realized it had not been fantasy or cruelty. It had been a summary. The real betrayal wasn't that she'd said it. It was that my son hadn't flinched. That absence of protest, that silence, that was the moment the floor shifted. That is the thing people never understand about women my age. It's not the insult that changes us. It's the confirmation we didn't want. The catalyst was not a single sentence. It was the stack of paper on my desk, aligning with it too neatly to ignore. I sat there until the light outside the window turned the dusty rose of late afternoon, the kind of light my husband loved, the kind that made our old curtains glow. The cat brushed against my leg. The house hummed. The life I had built laid itself out in front of me, in manila folders and fading signatures, and in the middle of that quiet, a thought arrived as calmly as if I were making a grocery list. They cannot inherit what I do not leave them. It didn't feel vengeful. It felt like standing up after sitting too long. I put the documents back carefully, locked the drawer, and took the small key from its ribbon, this time slipping it into the pocket of my cardigan instead of its usual dish on the shelf. The metal felt heavier than it ever had before, less like a household object and more like a verdict. That night, when he called again, because of course he did, because once people start circling, they do not like loose ends, his tone was softer, asking if I'd had a chance to look at those forms, assuring me he could walk me through them, insisting it was just a precaution. Nothing changes day to day. I listened to the gentle pressure pressed into every word. I pictured his spreadsheet with my death penciled in like a line item. I told him I had seen enough and that I needed time to think. He mistook that, too, for compliance. He thanked me, called me Mom in that indulgent voice, and hung up believing, I imagine, that the foundation he had laid under my life would hold. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the real foundation had never been his future. It had been my choice. And by the time I set the phone down, the choice had already been made in that deep secret chamber inside an old woman where fear and fury harden into resolve. The next morning, just after 9, when the light was clear and the kettle had whistled and the house smelled faintly of last night's apples, I sat once more at that little desk, opened the drawer, took out the business card I had kept for 30 years, and dialed the number of the lawyer who had watched us sign our lives into this place. When his assistant answered and asked how she could help, I said, in a voice that did not shake, "Tell him Eleanor will be selling the house. I'd like to ensure my son has no claim he has not yet earned." I did not become ruthless overnight. It's important you understand that. People like to imagine an old woman snapping in one clean moment, slamming her fist on a table and declaring war, but reality drips. It does not explode. The morning I called the lawyer, my voice steady, my hand wrapped around the receiver like it was 1985 again. Nothing outside of me looked different. My coffee still went cold on the counter. The cat still pawed at the back door for no reason. The neighbor's sprinklers still came on at the wrong angle and sprayed the street more than the roses. But inside, something that had always leaned toward my son, some small domestic gravity, quietly tipped back toward me. The lawyer remembered me, which both comforted and offended me. Comforted because there is dignity in being recalled as more than the mother, and offended because it meant enough time had passed for people to be surprised I was still alive. His voice came on the line a few minutes after I left my name with the young assistant who called me ma'am in a tone that belonged in a pediatrician's office. I could almost see his face as he spoke. Older now, a little slower, but the same cautious precision. We did the pleasantries, the obligatory condolences about my husband, although he'd been gone years, and then he asked, in that gentle professional suspicion reserved for the elderly, what exactly it was I wanted to do. I told him I was considering the sale of the house and wanted to be very clear on title, on authority, on signatures required, on who had a right to anything beyond what I allowed. There was a pause, the thin kind, and then he said carefully that according to his records and the documents I should still have in my possession, the property was solely in my name. My husband's portion had passed fully to me years ago. My son's name was nowhere on the deed. There were no liens, no claims, nothing to bind me to anyone's plan but my own. He asked, as they all do now, whether I felt pressured by anyone, whether someone was in the room, whether I was fully comfortable making such decisions. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because in that moment I understood the ugly symmetry. My son wanted paperwork to declare me incapable. The lawyer needed proof I was not. I told him, with more steel than maybe was polite, that no one was pressuring me into selling. They were, in fact, assuming they would never have to ask. He exhaled, a small human sound behind the legal one, and said that if I wished, he could recommend a discreet appraiser and an agent who would not involve family unless legally necessary. That phrase settled around me like a shawl. We set a date for him to come by, a weekday afternoon, when I knew my son would be at his office, and Lisa at whatever things women like her did in gyms that smell of eucalyptus and self-hatred. I hung up feeling more tired than triumphant. That is another thing they never tell you about reclaiming your life in old age. It is exhausting, like moving furniture that has been sitting in the same place for decades. After that call, the world did not applaud. Instead came the slow, subtle tightening. My son called that evening, casual again, wanting to check in, slipping in a question about whether I had any thoughts on the documents he'd sent, reminding me that these things were so much easier if handled early, as if he were talking about vaccinations instead of erasures. I told him I was getting some independent advice, letting the words hang there like a soft warning, and he went very quiet for a moment before saying that, of course, that was fine. He just wanted what was best. Lisa texted the next day with a link to an amazing new community with landscape gardens and on-site nurses and so much social engagement, writing that it would break her heart to picture me alone in that big old house if anything happened. I looked at the message for a long time before replying with a simple, "Thank you," no emojis, no warmth. I watched the little dots appear and vanish. She was waiting for more, and when it did not come, she fell silent. That was the new rhythm. Small, strategic touches disguised as concern. My son would drop phrases like long-term security and protecting you from scams into ordinary conversations about groceries and the weather. Lisa began asking little questions about bills. Had I remembered to pay the property tax? Did I need help organizing the insurance? Did I find online banking confusing? Each question alone was nothing. Together they were a net, thrown lightly, pretending to be a blanket. I answered each one with calm specificity, reciting numbers, due dates, balances with an accuracy that made her replies shorter every time. It annoyed them, my clarity. You could feel it. They wanted me confused enough to hand things over, grateful enough to call their control kindness. Instead, I was lucid, polite, and increasingly unavailable. Meanwhile, the appraiser came on a Tuesday that smelled like rain. I baked another cake so the house would welcome him like an old friend, some reflex I could not unlearn, and walked through each room at his side while he measured and muttered to himself about square footage and market conditions and original, features with nostalgic appeal, as if my life were a selling point. I watched his eyes. He saw the place, not the ghosts. Maybe that was what I needed. When he left, promising to send his assessment, I sat down at the dining table and realized the first escalation had already begun. There were now numbers attached to my exit, figures that could climb and fall irrespective of my son's expectations. The house was no longer an inevitability for him. It was a variable for me. In the evenings, I noticed how they called more often, but came less. Physical presence requires effort. Influence can be attempted over the phone. On one call, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd spoken to a friend in estate law who emphasized how messy things could get if documents weren't streamlined. I let him talk until his own words tangled, then asked very gently whether his friend had also explained that without my consent, he had no legal path to my house while I lived. He mumbled something about just wanting to avoid future disputes. I told him there was only one way to avoid disputes over my estate, to accept that it was mine until I said otherwise. To his credit, or perhaps to his shame, he did not argue directly. Instead, there was that injured tone, that weary sigh, that suggestion I was misinterpreting his good intentions. The quiet cruelty of that made my teeth ache. Days folded around this new tension. Each time I heard my phone vibrate, I felt my shoulders rise before my mind did. Each visit, rare and brief, carried a thin film of assessment. Lisa's eyes would flit over the banister, the driveway, the garden, cataloging potential repairs, mentally spending money they had not earned. Once, as we stood in the kitchen after coffee, she let her hand rest on the counter and said, in a tone she thought was offhand, that they'd probably open this whole space up one day, make it brighter, more modern. It has good bones, she said, like she was complimenting an old horse destined for a different rider. I looked around at the room that had heard my son's first word, my husband's last cough, 1,000 quiet mornings, and said only, "It's held up so far." She smiled without understanding I wasn't agreeing. That was how the escalation worked. No screaming, no scenes, just an increasing mismatch between the home as they imagined it and the refuge as I inhabited it. At night I lay awake not from fear, but from an awareness that I was being slowly moved in their minds from person to problem to eventual paperwork. It is a special kind of loneliness to sit in a chair you bought with your own wages and feel like a guest in the will someone else has drafted around your life. I started making small, invisible changes. the way a woman does when she has decided without telling anyone. I gathered the jewelry that meant nothing to anyone but me, the letters my husband wrote from work trips, the family photos where I was more than a shadow at the edge of the frame. I put them in one box and labeled it in faint pencil, not with names, but with destinations only I understood. I called the number of an old friend who lived 2 towns over and asked casually about rents, about the noise level in her building, about whether the buses still ran on time. She talked for too long about her grandchildren, then caught herself and apologized, asking if I was thinking of finally traveling. I said maybe. The truth was I had already started traveling in the only way that mattered, away from the idea that I owed my bones to a bloodline that had begun to speak of me in actuarial tables. There was a Sunday when they all came together. Lisa with the children, my son with his laptop bag, the baby in a stroller so complicated it looked like a lunar vehicle. They stayed exactly 1 hour and 40 minutes. You learn to count these things. Lisa scrolled on her phone between remarks about gluten and school admissions. My son took a call. He couldn't move. The children barely looked up. As they were leaving, he stood in the doorway, straightening his cuff, and said, "By the way, Mom, did you see the forms I highlighted? No rush, but it'd really mean a lot to know everything is squared away, for your peace of mind." For my peace of mind, I smiled, that small closed-mouth smile women of my generation mastered when men explained our own good to us, and said, "I've been taking care of my peace of mind longer than you've been alive, darling, but thank you for thinking of it." He frowned, not used to the edges in my voice, kissed my cheek, and left with his family and his assumptions. When the door closed and the house sighed into silence, I did not feel abandoned. I felt confirmed. The first moves had been made. They had shown me, without quite meaning to, that they preferred a version of me that signed and vanished. In response, I had invited the lawyer, the appraiser, my own long-dormant courage into the rooms they believed were already theirs. The escalation was not fireworks. It was the simple fact that every polite suggestion they made landed on a woman who was already packing in her mind. The day the lawyer arrived with his worn briefcase and that careful half-smile of a man who has spent his life translating other people's decisions into language the law can respect, the air smelled of wet earth and something close to forgiveness. I had been up since dawn, cleaning in a way that wasn't really about cleanliness. I polished frames, folded towels, arranged the same bowl of apples 3 times, anything to keep my hands occupied while my mind paced the perimeter of what I was about to do. The appraiser's report lay on the table, a neat sheaf of numbers that looked almost indecent in their certainty. The figure at the bottom, bold and round, made me dizzy for a moment. More money than I had ever held at once, enough to build another life, to vanish without being a story on anyone's tongue. When I heard the knock, steady and professional, I realized I had been waiting not just for him, but for permission from the universe to move forward. He stepped inside, shook the rain from his coat, and we exchanged the small talk of old acquaintances who are not quite friends. Then he set the briefcase on the dining table and asked if we could sit. He unfolded documents with the reverence of a priest arranging sacraments. I listened as he explained my options, each word crisp and neutral, but underneath it all ran a current of something like disbelief that a woman my age had called him to do this without prompting from a son or a husband. I asked questions about escrow, about capital gains, about the timeline of sale, slowly, deliberately, so he could not mistake my clarity for fragility. At one point, he looked up, hesitated, and said, "You know, Mrs. Hale, you don't have to do this quickly. You have every right to stay." I smiled at that, because he thought he was offering me comfort, when in truth he was naming the very chain I was breaking. I stayed long enough, I said, and he nodded, understanding more than I had expected. After he left, leaving me with copies of everything and a promise to contact an agent discreetly, I sat in the quiet that followed, like a diver sitting on the edge of the pool before the plunge. The rain outside had softened into mist, and the house felt different, as if it knew its future was being rewritten. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture the way one touches the arm of a friend before parting. In the living room, the photograph of my wedding caught the dim light. I lifted it and studied the young woman I had been, smiling, flushed with hope, her hand clutching the man she thought would always be the answer. I wanted to tell her she'd done fine, that she would survive more than she ever expected, that even when the years turned her hands into maps of old battles, she would still have enough strength left for one more rebellion. That evening, my son called again. He had begun to sense a shift, not through anything I said, but through what I no longer offered. No updates about the garden, no soft laughter at his condescension, no eager reassurance. He asked if I was feeling all right, if I'd been lonely out there. The phrase "out there" made me smile. He already imagined me as something distant, fading, almost geographical. I told him I'd been busy with paperwork. A pause. "What kind of paperwork?" he asked, too casually. "Oh, just the kind that keeps life interesting," I replied. He laughed, forced, and changed the subject to the children's school play. He wanted to keep me safely inside small talk, where I couldn't surprise him. I let him. When we hung up, I felt a strange tenderness for the boy he once was, the one who used to slip his hand into mine at crosswalks and trust me to know when to move. Now he was the one trying to control the traffic of my life, unaware that I'd already stepped off the curb. The following week, the real estate agent came by. Her name was Nina, mid-30s, brisk but kind, the kind of woman who wore her hair pulled tight so no one would mistake her youth for inexperience. She walked through the rooms with professional eyes, jotting notes, asking about renovations and foundations. When she complimented the woodwork, I told her my husband had done it all himself, nights and weekends, sanding until his fingers bled. She ran her hand along the banister with respect. "He knew what he was doing," she said. I liked her immediately for that. We sat at the table to discuss strategy, quiet listing, minimal signage, viewings by appointment only. She promised discretion and an understanding of sensitive situations. I could tell she assumed some family dispute. I didn't correct her. Before leaving, she looked around and said, almost shyly, "This house has heart. Whoever buys it will feel that." The words landed deep. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to see the living pulse beneath all the years. Once the paperwork was in motion, time changed texture. The days no longer crawled. They shimmered with secret urgency. I began to go through drawers, sorting decades of accumulation, separating what mattered from what was simply proof I had existed. I found the sweater my husband wore every winter, still faintly smelling of cedar. I folded it gently and placed it in the donation box, then removed it again, unable to let it go. I opened old notebooks filled with recipes in my handwriting, some stained with oil, others with tears. I tore out a few pages to keep, recipes no one else would want, but that carried conversations embedded between lines. His favorite stew, my mother's cake. As I worked, I spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to the house itself, thanking it for holding so much without complaint. One afternoon, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror, standing amid boxes and open drawers, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were clear, almost defiant, her mouth set in a line that was not bitterness, but intention. I thought of all the years I had trained myself to be agreeable, to smooth edges, to apologize for taking up space in rooms my own hands had cleaned. That version of me had been necessary once, but now she was shedding like old skin. I realized the midpoint of this story wasn't the sale itself. It was this recognition that I had spent a lifetime believing survival and obedience were the same thing. They aren't. Nina called a few days later to say there were already interested buyers, couples who loved charm and character, phrases that both comforted and saddened me. I told her to proceed, but to keep my name off any casual mention. The fewer eyes from my old world that noticed, the better. That night, I sat with a glass of wine I didn't particularly enjoy and imagined the house filled with other voices, maybe a family who would hang drawings on the refrigerator instead of silence. The image didn't hurt as much as I expected. It felt like the natural ending of a book I'd been rereading too long. The small acts of withdrawal began to multiply. I stopped answering every call. I let their texts sit unread until I was ready. When my son dropped by unannounced one Saturday, his face tense with the forced cheerfulness of a man who suspects he's losing something, I greeted him with the kind of calm that makes people nervous. He walked through the rooms like an inspector, commenting on repairs that needed doing, on how quiet the neighborhood was, for now. I offered him coffee. He refused, pacing instead, saying Lisa was worried I was isolating. I told him isolation can be a form of safety, that quiet is a language you learn after years of being spoken over. He looked at me like he didn't know the alphabet. When he left, he said, "I just don't want you to make any rash decisions." I smiled at his back and whispered, "I already made one." In the weeks that followed, I began taking long walks again, through streets that smelled of pine and cold asphalt, past houses where curtains fluttered and lives continued without my permission. I found a small cafe at the edge of town where no one knew me. The waitress called everyone honey, and no one looked at my hands as if they were relics. I started writing again, little notes to myself on napkins, sentences about freedom, about ownership, about how strange it felt to breathe without permission. It was as if my brain, unused to unmonitored thought, was stretching awake. Sometimes I caught myself humming as I walked home, and it startled me. The sound of my own contentment after so much careful silence. When the offer came, a young family, polite, pre-approved, eager, I accepted without hesitation. Nina brought the paperwork, explaining every clause, and I signed with a hand that didn't shake. The ink bled slightly on one page, like a pulse. After she left, I sat at the table with the final copy in front of me and let the reality settle. The house was sold. Not in theory, not in revenge, but in fact. I expected grief to rush in, but what came was something gentler, like cool air after a storm. I made tea, carried the cup to the porch, and watched the light change across the yard. I thought about my husband again, about his last words, about how he'd feared leaving me alone. He hadn't understood that solitude, in the end, would be the only inheritance worth keeping. That evening, when my son called, I didn't answer. I turned off the phone, drew the curtains, and allowed myself to feel the fullness of my own company. It wasn't victory, it was balance restored. The midpoint had come and passed, and somewhere inside the quiet hum of the house, I could already hear the future unpacking its boxes. The first sign that my son knew something had shifted was the bouquet. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be carrying such a heavy thing for such a small house. Lilies, white as excuses, wrapped in cellophane that caught the light like a wedding veil. The card was printed, not written. Thinking of you. Hope you're well. Love, Michael and Lisa. It wasn't love. It was reconnaissance disguised as sentiment. They'd never sent flowers before, not for birthdays, not for anniversaries, not for anything. The timing told me everything. The sale had been listed quietly, but news travels like smoke through the cracks of family. Someone must have seen the agent's car, or overheard a conversation, or perhaps Lisa, restless and curious, had searched the local listings on her phone one night while pretending to scroll through news. Either way they knew, and the performance began. The phone calls came next, first once a week, then every few days, each one staged as concern, but strung together by a single nervous refrain. "Are you sure you're doing okay?" It was the tone of someone checking the temperature of a pot they can't yet touch. I answered politely at first, careful not to reveal too much, because there's a power in withholding when people expect confession. But their restraint didn't last. One evening, as I was folding laundry that didn't need folding, my phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang once more, and I knew avoidance would only sharpen their curiosity, so I picked up. "Mom," my son began, his voice already in the register of disappointment. "Lisa saw something online. She said there's a house listed on Maple Drive that looks just like yours. That can't be right, can it?" I said. "It's exactly right." There was a silence so long I could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind me. Finally, he exhaled through his teeth. "I don't understand. You didn't even tell us you were thinking about moving." "I wasn't thinking," I said. "I was deciding." That threw him off balance. He stammered something about wanting to help, about logistics, about how complicated things like that can be for someone my age. I listened until the words became noise, and then I said, very quietly, "You've been planning what happens to this house after I die. The least I can do is decide what happens before that." He made that small wounded sound that men make when their authority is questioned by the very woman they thought they were protecting. "We weren't planning anything, Mom. You're twisting everything. Lisa was just joking." Then she should learn the difference between a joke and a prophecy. He sighed again, and in that sigh, I heard all the years of his irritation with me condensed into one breath. "You're being impulsive. This isn't like you." "No," I said. "It's exactly like me. You've just forgotten what I'm like when I'm not bending." After that, he began to visit more often, always alone, as if Lisa's presence might make me dig in my heels further. He'd arrive in a suit, loosen his tie at the door, and walk through the rooms like a surveyor, asking questions meant to sound casual. "Do you know where you'll go? Do you have a plan for storage? What about taxes?" I answered every one of them calmly, like a witness on the stand who knows the verdict is already decided. His attempts at reason grew into appeals, then guilt. He'd mention the grandchildren, how much they loved visiting, how confused they'd be if Grandma's house was suddenly gone. The manipulation was subtle, almost tender, but I recognized the architecture of control under its polite surface. I had built a lifetime studying such structures. The first time he raised his voice, it shocked even him. He'd been pacing the living room, trying to make me see sense, when suddenly he turned toward me, eyes bright with a mixture of anger and fear. "This house is part of our family, Mom. Dad built it for us." "No," I said, standing as well. "He built it for me. You were a child. You didn't lay a single brick." He blinked, as if I'd spoken blasphemy. "That's not fair." "What's not fair," I said, "is being spoken of in the past tense by people who still use my dishes." He left soon after that, without hugging me, the door closing with a sharp, defensive click. I stood there for a long while, listening to the silence that followed. It was not peace, but it was mine. A week later, Lisa appeared unannounced. I saw her car through the kitchen window before she even knocked. Silver, spotless, expensive. She walked up the path with the brisk confidence of someone who has already decided they are right. When I opened the door, she smiled too brightly and said, "I just wanted to check on you. Mike's been worried sick." I stepped aside to let her in because I wanted her to see everything she would never own. She looked around the living room with that practiced half-interest of someone scanning for flaws. "You've really kept it nice," she said. "It's just such a big place for one person. I'd go crazy with all this space." "Then it's good that you'll never have to," I said. She laughed, thinking I was joking. When she realized I wasn't, the laugh died in her throat. She sat down on the edge of the sofa and crossed her legs. "You know," she began, "it's just, Mike feels like he's losing you. You've been so distant lately. And now this sale thing, it feels sudden." "Sudden," I repeated. "Lisa, I've been living in this house for nearly 50 years. Nothing I do now is sudden. What's sudden is realizing I've become an inheritance you're waiting to cash." Her face tightened. That controlled kind of smile women wear when they're trying not to show fear. "That's not fair. We love you. We just thought—" "Yes," I interrupted. You thought and thought until you made plans, but you never asked." She tried again, this time softening her voice, almost whispering, "You know, you could come live with us. The kids would love it. We'd fix up the guest room." I laughed then, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest, too real to be polite. "You want me in your guest room? You mean the one next to the laundry? You'd have me neatly folded and stored before dinner." Her eyes filled with tears, not sorrow, but humiliation. She stood up, adjusted her jacket, and said, "You're being cruel." "No," I said, still smiling. "I'm being clear." After she left, I made myself a cup of tea, the old ritual. My hands shook a little, not from regret, but from the echo of confrontation. There's a tremor that follows truth spoken aloud, like the body adjusting to new gravity. The next day, I received a voicemail from my son, tight and careful. "Mom, Lisa's really upset. This is getting out of hand. Please don't do anything drastic until we can talk." I deleted it without listening to the end. The offers for the house began to come in faster. Nina managed it all efficiently, protecting me from the noise, filtering the buyers, handling the logistics. Each time she called, I felt lighter, as if every step closer to the sale was a step away from being erased. But of course, my family did not disappear. Their efforts simply evolved. Lisa sent long emails about how difficult it was to explain everything to the children, how disappointed she was that I was pushing them away. Michael began copying me on correspondence with financial advisors, articles about elderly fraud, statistics about scams, all laced with the implication that I was being manipulated by someone other than them. It was almost elegant, the way they inverted guilt, dressing control in the costume of concern. When the for sale sign appeared on the lawn, they stopped pretending. One afternoon, as I was returning from the post office, I found their car parked in front of the house. They were standing by the sign, talking in low voices. Lisa's arms were folded. Michael's jaw was tight. When they saw me, they straightened, both wearing the kind of smiles that look rehearsed. "We thought maybe we could talk inside," my son said. "I prefer the air out here," I replied. "Mom, please," he said, glancing at the neighbors' windows. "This isn't the place." "Oh, but it is," I said. "This is the exact place, the place you thought would one day be yours." Lisa stepped forward, her voice trembling now, part anger, part desperation. Do you really want to sell to strangers? Do you have any idea what that will feel like? Seeing other people in your kitchen, in your bedroom. I imagine it'll feel a lot like watching my son and his wife measure it with their eyes while I was still alive. She blinked, and for a second her mask cracked. You're punishing us. I shook my head. No, I'm freeing myself. My son's face reddened. This isn't what Dad would have wanted. Your father wanted me respected, I said. Not managed. They left then, both furious and wounded, and I watched their car speed away, the tires kicking up small stones that scattered across the driveway like punctuation marks on a sentence I'd finally finished. That night I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline of confrontation had drained into something heavier, grief maybe, or the quiet knowledge that I had crossed a point of no return. I walked through the darkened house barefoot, touching the walls, the edges of furniture, the cool surface of the piano we hadn't played in years. I whispered to the air, "You did the right thing." The house didn't answer, but the silence felt approving. The following morning, Nina called to confirm the final offer. It was higher than expected, clean, no contingencies. I told her to accept. When I hung up, I saw a message from my son waiting in my inbox, the subject line blank, as if even he didn't know what to call what we were now. I didn't open it. The days leading up to the closing passed like a long exhale. I found myself noticing small details I'd ignored for decades. The way the light shifted across the floor at noon, the faint creak in the hallway that always came before rain, the ghost smell of my husband's aftershave when I opened certain drawers. I began packing in earnest, one room at a time. Every object demanded a decision: keep, give, let go. It was a kind of quiet reckoning. A week before the final signing, Michael appeared again, this time without warning, without pretense. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes sleepless. He didn't ask to come in. He simply stood on the porch and said, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" I told him I was. He nodded, swallowing hard. "You're cutting us out." "No," I said softly. "I'm cutting you free." He looked at me for a long moment, then turned away, his shoulders rigid. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," I answered. "But at least it'll be my regret." When he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between us. Love, disappointment, the slow corrosion of expectation. I cried then, not from weakness, but from release. The tears were hot and clean, washing away years of trying to be the woman they wanted instead of the woman I was. When they stopped, I felt lighter than I had in decades. 2 days later, I signed the final documents. The lawyer handed me the pen with ceremony, and when I pressed it to paper, the ink flowed steady and dark, like the beginning of a new language. I handed the pen back, smiled, and said, "Done." He nodded, offering a polite congratulations, but I could tell he understood that what I had signed wasn't merely a contract. It was an emancipation. That night, as I locked the front door for one of the last times, I stood on the porch and looked out over the yard, the trees silhouetted against a sky thick with stars. The air smelled of grass and distance. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called, low and patient. I thought of my son, my daughter-in-law, their restless certainty that I was slipping away, and I realized they were right, but not in the way they feared. I wasn't disappearing. I was arriving, finally, entirely, in my own life. The morning of the closing was unnaturally bright, the kind of light that seems to burn away hesitation. I woke before the alarm, my body already alert, as if the air itself had called me to attention. For a moment I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house breathing around me. The small click in the pipes, the creak of the floorboards shifting as they had every dawn for nearly 50 years. I tried to imagine the same sounds belonging to someone else, other footsteps tracing these patterns, other lives moving through these rooms. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt like watching a bird fly from a branch. It had rested long enough, and now it was time for it to go where I couldn't follow. I made tea instead of coffee. Coffee carries the smell of staying, but tea is the ritual of leaving. I took my cup to the porch and stood there barefoot, letting the cold wood ground me. The sky was clear, a shade of blue that seemed almost new, as though it had been painted fresh for my departure. When the lawyer's car arrived, I felt something close to calm. He stepped out holding a folder, gave a small nod, and asked if I wanted to drive with him or meet at the office. I chose to ride along. I didn't trust myself to sit in that house alone one more time, waiting for the moment to arrive. I might have started looking for reasons to delay it, and delay is the cousin of surrender. The drive was quiet. The town unfolded outside the window in scenes I knew by heart. Mrs. Connolly's bakery, the church steeple, the hardware store where my husband used to buy nails by the pound. Each landmark passed like a chapter heading, the story of a woman who had once belonged everywhere and now belonged only to herself. At the office, the buyer was already there, a young couple, hardly 30, with the kind of eagerness that makes people stand too straight and talk too fast. They were polite, nervous, careful not to show how much they loved the house for fear the price might rise. When I entered, they both stood. The woman had dark curls and eyes that looked perpetually astonished by kindness. The man's hands trembled slightly when he greeted me. I saw in them the beginning of a life that still believed in continuity, in promises, in shared futures. For a second, something inside me softened. They reminded me of us, long ago, when the world still felt negotiable. The lawyer began reading through the documents, his voice steady, the rhythm bureaucratic, the kind of voice that seems to drain all emotion from a room. But underneath that dull cadence, I could feel the beating of something enormous, the closing of one life and the start of another. My son's face flickered in my mind. The child he was, the man he became, the expression he would wear when he realized there was no undoing this. I let the image pass without bitterness. You can love someone and still deny them ownership of you. When the papers were placed before me, I read each line slowly, as if language itself deserved to be respected on this day. The lawyer pointed to the final page and said, "Sign here, Mrs. Hale." The couple leaned forward almost imperceptibly. My hand didn't shake. The pen moved across the paper with the precision of decision, and when I lifted it, I felt the strangest sense of stillness, as if every sound in the room had paused to witness the moment. The lawyer took the document, added his signature, and then it was done. Just like that, half a century reduced to ink and transfer. He congratulated us. The buyers thanked me, and for a moment I thought I might cry, but the tears stayed where they were, obedient, unnecessary. When we stepped outside, the sun was higher, the heat almost kind. The couple approached me, shy now that the transaction was complete. The young woman said, "We'll take good care of it, I promise." Her voice was trembling, sincere. I looked at her and nodded. "I know you will," I said. "Houses like to be lived in. They get lonely when people start treating them as trophies." She smiled, not entirely understanding, but grateful anyway. The man said, "It's such an honor to buy a place with history." I almost laughed at that, thinking how history, in the end, is just what remains when love has finished its work. The lawyer offered to drive me back, but I declined. I wanted to walk. I wanted to feel the ground, the town, the weight of my own body moving unassisted. The air shimmered with that late spring clarity that makes even the ordinary look significant. As I walked, people nodded at me, some recognizing me, others not. I passed the grocery store, where I used to argue with my husband about brands, the bench where we once ate melting ice cream on a hot day. Everything looked both smaller and sharper, as if freedom changes the scale of things. When I reached home, no, not home, the house, I stood at the gate for a long time. The sold sign leaned slightly to one side. The yard was quiet except for the rustle of leaves, the sound of life continuing. I walked up the path, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was cooler there, heavy with the scent of polished wood and dust. My boxes were stacked neatly by the hallway, labeled in my handwriting, clothes, books, kitchen, memories. I ran my fingers over the words and felt the slight indentation of the pen, as if even cardboard remembers. I moved through each room slowly, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. The living room still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the last cake I baked. The sunlight touched the floor in stripes, painting the same pattern it had for decades. I stood by the window and watched dust particles drift in the air, turning gold in the light. They looked like time itself, weightless but visible. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed the coverlet one last time. I whispered to the emptiness, "We did what we could, didn't we?" and felt the answer settle softly in my chest. Then came the sound of tires on gravel, a car pulling into the driveway. My stomach tightened before my mind did. I knew who it was before I looked. The rhythm of his footsteps was unchanged since childhood, quick, decisive, a little too loud, as though the world needed reminding of his existence. The knock came next, not tentative, not furious, just certain. I opened the door. He stood there, eyes dark, jaw set, the expression of a man who has come not to plead, but to reclaim. Behind him, Lisa sat in the car, arms folded, sunglasses masking her face. "You sold it," he said, his voice low. Not a question. Yes, to strangers. They're not strangers anymore. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "How could you do that? Without telling me? Without even talking to us?" "I did talk," I said. "You just didn't listen." He laughed, bitter, helpless. "You've lost it. You've really—" He stopped himself, looked away, then back at me. "Do you have any idea what this does to us, to the kids? You've destroyed everything Dad built." "Your father built a home," I said quietly. "You tried to turn it into a monument to your future. That's not the same thing." He took a step back, his hands shaking. "You'll regret this, Mom." I looked at him for a long moment, the man who had once clung to my hand at the doctor's office, who used to wake from nightmares calling for me. I saw in him not malice, but fear, the kind that comes when the ground of entitlement gives way. I said, "Maybe, but regret is mine to live with, not yours to assign." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his anger collapsing into something smaller, almost boyish. "I don't understand you anymore," he said. "That's all right," I said. "Understanding isn't required, only distance." He stood there, silent, then turned and walked back to the car. Lisa didn't look at me as they drove away. I watched until the sound of the engine faded, until the road lay empty again. Then I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a long time, breathing. The silence that followed was deep, clean, absolute. It was the sound of a life rearranging itself around truth. That night I stayed in the house one final time, sleeping on a bare mattress, surrounded by the echo of absence. I dreamed not of loss, but of water, of a river running wide and dark, carrying away what no longer needed to stay. When I woke, the first light of morning filled the room, and I knew it was time. I carried my suitcase to the car, waiting in the drive, placed the key on the kitchen counter, and stood there one last moment. "Thank you," I whispered, to the walls, to the years, to the woman I had been here. Then I stepped outside, closed the door, and didn't look back. Driving away, I felt no triumph, only clarity. The house receded in the rearview mirror until it became a shape among trees, then nothing at all. For the first time in years, I did not feel watched or owed or waiting. I felt alive, singular, unbequeathed. The road ahead shimmered in the sun, and I pressed my foot lightly on the gas, as though testing the future's patience. Somewhere, a radio played an old song I half remembered, and I began to hum along, my voice steady, my hands sure. The story was finished. The woman in it was not. The first night in the new place was the kind of quiet that startles you, because it isn't the silence of abandonment, but the silence of beginning again. The cottage stood at the edge of the sea, small, square, and smelling faintly of salt and paint. I had chosen it because of the view, the ocean stretching like an unwritten page, and because the rent was low enough to leave me with a sense of prudence rather than poverty. When the moving van left, and I was alone amid my boxes, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea and listened to the waves. They moved with such authority, as if they didn't care who watched, and I envied that. I had spent a lifetime being careful not to make waves, smoothing over tempers, keeping peace like a second job. Now, the sound of their insistence became the pulse of everything I had reclaimed. For the first few days, I lived as though testing my own reality. I woke early, opened the curtains, and let the light flood in. I walked down to the shore with my shoes in hand, feeling the sting of cold water on my feet. I bought groceries in small portions, cooked only for myself, ate when I was hungry instead of when a clock suggested I should. There was an odd liberation in the simplicity of my solitude. It required no explanation, no performance. Each task, washing a dish, making the bed, sweeping sand from the floor, felt like a conversation with a self I had misplaced decades ago. The house was too small to echo, yet somehow everything I said inside it sounded true. On the third morning, I opened my email for the first time in a week. There were messages from my son, polite at first, then wounded, then silent. The last one said simply, "We hope you're safe. The kids miss you." I stared at it for a long time. The words hope and miss looked foreign, too easily typed. I thought of the children, my grandchildren, how they had come into the world, already surrounded by devices and distraction, how their idea of love was measured in calls made between obligations. I knew I would see them again someday, when the dust of resentment had settled into something softer. But I also knew that if I answered now, if I allowed them to draw me back into the orbit of apology and justification, I would lose the small, fragile freedom that had cost me everything. So I closed the laptop and went outside instead. The sea had changed color. It was the green of glass bottles, the kind that used to wash up on the shore when I was young. I stood there watching gulls dive, listening to the endless rhythm of water striking stone. There was no audience, no judgment, only the vast impartial patience of nature. That, I realized, was the gift of this new life, not happiness, which is too light a word, but permission to exist without being useful, to take up space without owing it to anyone. I breathed in the salt and thought of my husband, of the house we built, of the decades of compromise that had somehow carried me here. I whispered his name into the wind, not as a prayer, but as acknowledgement. He had built a home for us once. Now I was building one for myself. In the evenings, I started writing again. Nothing dramatic, just notes, small observations about the way light changed across the waves, or how the old couple next door argued in perfect rhythm, or how silence could feel like company if you stopped resisting it. The pages filled slowly, and in that slow filling, I found something close to peace. I began to see my story not as a tragedy, but as a long, winding reclamation. People talk about forgiveness as if it's an act of mercy toward others, but I think it's the opposite. Forgiveness is the final boundary you draw to protect your own peace. It isn't forgetting. It's refusing to keep drinking the poison. Once, about a month after I moved, I saw my son's number flash on my phone. My first instinct was to let it ring, but something inside me, curiosity perhaps, or the tender muscle of motherhood that never dies, made me answer. His voice was quiet, unsure, stripped of all the practiced control that had once defined it. He said he'd heard I was by the coast, asked if I was all right. I told him yes, I was fine. There was a pause, and then he said, almost pleadingly, I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I said, it didn't get bad. It just got honest. We stayed on the line without speaking for a while, and then he said he hoped we could visit someday. I told him maybe, when the sea changed its color again. He didn't know what that meant, but he said all right. When we hung up, I didn't cry. I went out onto the porch and watched the horizon blur into dusk, and for the first time in years, I felt time moving forward instead of circling back. Life settled into rhythm. I planted rosemary in a pot by the door, just as I had in the old house, a small continuity that smelled of comfort. I learned the names of my neighbors, 2 widows and a fisherman, all of whom minded their own lives with gentle precision. On Sundays, we sat together on the bench overlooking the sea, talking about nothing important. No one asked me about the past. No one needed me to justify my choices. We spoke instead about tides, about the price of bread, about the way the moon seemed to pull the water closer some nights. It was enough. Every now and then, I would dream of the old house, not as it had been in those final tense months, but as it was in the beginning, warm, humming, filled with music and the smell of soup on the stove. In the dream, I was younger, my husband still alive, and we were laughing over something unimportant. But when I woke, I didn't ache for it. The dream felt like a photograph gently placed back in its frame, no longer demanding to be lived again. One afternoon, I walked into town and passed an antique shop. In the window was a small ceramic key dish, the kind people keep by the door. I went inside and bought it. At home, I placed my new house key in it, hearing the small metallic sound as it settled. It reminded me of the last time I'd done that gesture, placing the old key on the kitchen counter of the house I'd left behind. It struck me then that keys don't just open doors, they close them too. Both actions are sacred if done at the right time. Now every morning, I sit on my porch with my tea and watch the sea stretch and change with the light. Sometimes it's gray, sometimes blue, sometimes the color of forgiveness. The world goes on without my permission, and that's its beauty. I've stopped asking for purpose. I exist, and that's enough. I think of other women, older, invisible, polite to the point of disappearance, and I wish I could tell them this, that you can still choose, even at the edge of everything, that freedom isn't the absence of love, but the return of your own voice after years of silence. I don't know if my son understands that yet. Maybe one day he will. Maybe one day he'll bring the children to visit, and they'll stand at the shore, and I'll tell them about a woman who sold her house and found her life waiting on the other side of the sea. Until then, I keep my kettle polished, my letters unwritten, my door unguarded but closed. I live quietly, fully, entirely mine. And when the wind rises at night, carrying the scent of salt and memory, I whisper the same words I said the day I left. They thought they'd get the house when I die, but I didn't have to die to leave. I just had to wake up.